So let's get right into it. We're going to talk about a kind of lost cuisine, a type of food that was really born out of pure necessity and incredible ingenuity in 19th century America. This is the story of what Chinese immigrant workers were cooking and eating, not in restaurants, but out in the middle of nowhere, in gold rush towns and along the railroad tracks. This right here is the food that kept them alive. This quote, it just really sets the whole scene, doesn't it? We're talking about men working these grueling, back-breaking 16-hour days. They were completely shut out from mainstream society. They couldn't just walk into an American diner and get a meal. So, in these crowded rooms, often with just a single cooking pot, they created a whole cuisine that has pretty much been forgotten. And that's the big question, right? What in the world did they eat when they had next to nothing? This wasn't food you'd ever find on a menu. This was created from scraps, from memories of their homes thousands of miles away, and from whatever they could scrape together in this new and, let's be honest, often hostile land. It was about survival, for sure, but it turned out to be so much more than that. I mean, when you're cooking with things that other people literally throw in the trash, these dishes, they aren't just about filling your stomach. They became this quiet proof that even when the world is trying to make you invisible, you can still create something that matters. It was, in a way, a culinary declaration of existence. Okay, so the first and maybe the most brilliant principle of this whole cuisine was transforming waste into food. It's all about seeing potential where everybody else just saw garbage. And that requires a level of ingenuity that is just wow. So what does that actually look like? Well, butchers would practically give away pork skin. It was worthless to them. But these men would simmer it for hours until it turned into this soft, gelatinous tearing. Vegetable peels, carrot tops, you name it, not thrown out. They were boiled to create a flavorful water that was then used to cook rice, infusing every single grain with a bit of taste. This isn't just about not wasting. It's about building entire dishes from the ground up with things no one else wanted. Bones were like treasure, and this process shows just how far they could make them go. So they boiled them once to get a really rich broth for a soup. But they didn't stop there. No way. They'd boil the same bones a second time, a third, maybe even a fourth time. By the end, the liquid was this clear bone water, but it still had a ghost of that richness, a memory of meat. And it was perfect for cooking fresh, hand-pulled noodles. Or get this, you know that thin film that forms on top of soy milk when you make it? Most people would just skim that off and toss it. They saw an opportunity. They would carefully lift it off, dry it into sheets, and then later on rehydrate it to roll up with wild greens. A byproduct suddenly becomes a protein-packed dish. It's the genius of seeing food where everyone else just sees trash. But okay, what if all you have are bland staples like rice or noodles? How do you make them taste like, well, anything? This leads us to the second principle, which is this kind of flavor alchemy, using a tiny amount of something really potent to elevate a meal for a whole group of people. Just one. What on earth could one single thing do in a kitchen trying to feed dozens of hungry men? One single rock-hard, dried fish. You wouldn't dare cook the whole thing at once. That would be an insane waste. Instead, they would carefully shave off these paper-thin slices, just tiny little shavings. They'd toss those into a huge pot of steaming rice, and the heat would just release all that salt, all that flavor of the ocean, infusing every single grain. One fish, flavoring meals for a week. It's incredible. And this flavor magic was everywhere. Plain wheat noodles were completely transformed with just a spoonful of rendered pork fat. Boiled eggs, a great portable protein, they were steeped in strong, salty tea that not only preserved them, but it gave them this amazing, earthy flavor. And plain steamed rice could become a savory dish with just a little sprinkle of shrimp dust, which they made by grinding up the cheap, broken pieces of dried shrimp nobody else wanted. And not rendered pork fat, you have to understand, that stuff was treated like liquid gold. Every last scrap of fat was carefully trimmed and slowly cooked down into this precious, flavorful liquid that they stored in jars. When you couldn't get soy sauce, A single spoonful of this stuff gave you flavor, fat, and the calories you desperately needed to get through another one of those grueling days. So, beyond using waste and stretching flavor, they also had to adapt. And this brings us to the third major principle: learning to use the American landscape itself, foraging for wild ingredients and folding them right into their cooking traditions. So instead of buying vegetables, they would often just walk outside. They'd gather wild mustard greens they found growing freely along the railroad tracks. And when meat was way too expensive, they'd still make dumplings a food of celebration, but they would fill them only with those foraged greens. They also adapted to American crops like corn. And this quote about the charred corn, man, it says it all. Corn was not a traditional Chinese ingredient, but they cooked it their way, in a searingly hot pan with some oil and salt, charring the kernels until they were all smoky and sweet. This wasn't some kind of trendy fusion cuisine. This was survival, adaptation, and creativity all happening at once in a single pan. But here's the thing, this food was never just about calories. We've seen the what and the how, but the why, that's where the real story is. This cuisine was fundamentally about preserving a piece of who you were, about building a community, and just maintaining your dignity when you're facing incredible hardship. A perfect example of this is the one chicken, 10 men philosophy. So on a really good day, they might be able to buy a single chicken, and every single part of it, the meat, the bones, the feet, everything was used. It was all cut up, boiled, and then shared out. Nobody got a full meal from their little portion, but that wasn't the point. The point was that everyone got something. It was a system built on solidarity. I just think about the labor involved. I mean, making hand-pleated dumplings or these soft, pillowy, steamed buns, it's definitely not the most efficient way to get calories in you. But those actions, that was a direct link to home. The very act of making them, even with humble fillings like mashed beans or wild greens, was a way to practice a tradition and feel a sense of normalcy, a sense of care. So when you boil it all down, this food was a lifeline. It was a taste of home and a deeply foreign land. It was a symbol that held an entire community together. It was an act of dignity, insisting on making something thoughtful and delicious out of scraps. And really, every single meal was a quiet declaration that they were still there. And maybe, just maybe, nothing captures this entire philosophy better than one last dish. They would take yesterday's leftover cold hard rice, press it all into little cakes, and then pan-fry them in oil. And the result? Something totally new. Crispy and golden on the outside, but still soft and steaming on the inside. It's the perfect metaphor, turning waste into worth, turning yesterday's scraps into today's comfort. And that's really what it all comes down to. This wasn't fancy food. It wasn't pretty food. But it was warm, and it was made with hands that had worked all day long. In a world that gave them almost nothing. This food was a quiet, defiant, and deeply human statement that says, I'm still here,